Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Kishore Kishori ki jai, Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Marani ki jai, Gornitai ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Sorry, I had to read the introduction to a new chapter we're beginning today, chapter 8 of text of Canto 11. We're doing one text today, the first one. But the light is not very good for me for reading, so you just have to give me a minute to get the database. Sorry, I can't get it here. Okay, I'm going to have to struggle with the bad light. So, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So, Canto 11, Chapter 8, the introduction, the story of Pingala. Lord Krishna told Uddhava how the Avadhuta Brahmana explained to Maharaj Yadu the instructions he had received from some of his gurus, beginning with the python. So that's coming up. Thank you. The instruction the Avadhuta Brahmana received from the python is that an intelligent person should cultivate a mentality of detachment and should maintain the body by accepting whatever comes of its own accord or is easily obtained. In this way, he should remain always engaged in the worship of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Even if no food is available, the person who wants to engage fully in the Lord's worship should not beg. Rather, he should understand this to be the arrangement of providence, thinking, whatever enjoyment is destined for me will automatically come, and thus I should not uselessly waste the remaining duration of my life in worrying about such things. If he does not get any food, he should simply remain lying like the python and patiently fix his mind in meditation upon the Supreme Lord. The instructions the Avadhuta Brahmana received from the ocean is that the mind of the sage who is devoted to the personality of Godhead appears very clear and grave, just like the still ocean waters. The ocean does not overflow during the rainy season when all the flooded rivers discharge their waters into it. Nor does it dry up during the dry season when the rivers do not supply it. Similarly, the sage does not become elated when he achieves desirable things, nor does he become distressed in their absence. instruction of the moth is that just as he becomes enticed by the fire and gives up his life, the fool who cannot, the light is so bad for me for reading. The fool who cannot control his senses becomes enchanted by the forms of, that may help, thank you. Sorry, I usually use a light when I'm reading. Oh, thank you, that does help. Becomes enchanted by the forms of women decorated with gold ornaments and fine clothing, chasing after these embodiments of the divine illusory energy of the Lord. He loses his life untimely and falls down into the most horrible hell. There are two kinds of bees, the bumblebee and the honeybee. The instruction learned from the bumblebee is that a sage should collect only small amounts of food from many different households, and thus, day after day, practice the occupation of madhukari for maintaining his existence. A sage should also collect the essential truth from all scriptures, be they great or insignificant. The instruction received from the second insect, the honeybee, is that a mendicant sannyasi should not save the food he begs for the sake of having it later that night or the next day, because if he does so, then just like the greedy honeybee, he will be destroyed along with his hoard. From the elephant, the Avadhuta Brahmana received the following instructions. Male elephants are tricked by hunters into moving towards captive female elephants, whereupon they fall into the hunter's ditch and are captured. Similarly, the man who becomes attached to the form of woman falls down into the deep well of material life and is destroyed. The instruction received from the honey thief is that just as he steals the honey collected with great effort by the honeybee, a person in the renounced order of life has the privilege of enjoying before anyone else the food and other valuable things purchased by the hard-earned money of the householders. The instruction from the deer is that just as he becomes confused upon hearing the song of the hunter's flute and loses his life, so also does any person who becomes attracted to mundane music and sings uselessly and song uselessly wastes his life. The instruction learnt from the fish is that because he comes under the sway of attachment to the sense of taste, he is caught on the baited fishhook and must die. Similarly, an unintelligent person who is victimized by his insatiable tongue will also end up losing his life. There was once a prostitute named Pingala in the city of Videha, and from her, the Avadhuta learned another lesson. One day, she dressed herself in very attractive clothing and ornaments and was waiting from sunset until midnight for a customer. She waited in great anticipation. But as the time passed, her mind became very uneasy. No man came to see her, and in disgust, she finally became renounced, giving up the hankering for the arrival of a suitor. Thereafter, she engaged herself in thinking only of the Supreme Lord Hari, and her mind achieved the supreme platform of peace. The instruction received from her is that hopes for sense gratification are the root cause of all suffering. Therefore, only one who has given up such hankering can fix himself in meditation upon the personality of Godhead and achieve transcendental peace. Vaishnav 700. Thank you very much for the torch. It was the right amount of light. So now we proceed to our text. Shri Brahmana Uvacha Sukham Aindriyakam Rajan Svarge Naraka Evacha Dehinam Yadyata Dukam Tasman Necheta Tad Buddha Shri Brahmana Uvacha Sukham Aindriyakam Rajan Svarge Naraka Evacha Dehinam Yadyata Dukam Tasman Necheta Tad Buddha Shri Brahmana Uvacha Sukham Aindriyakam Rajan Svarge Naraka Evacha Dehinam Yadyata Dukam Tasman Necheta Tad Buddha. Please chant. Shri Brahmana Uvacha Sukham Andriyakam Rajan Svarge Naraka Evacha Dehinam Yadyata Dukam Tasman Necheta Tad Buddha. Shri Brahmana Uvacha Naraka Evacha Dehinam Yadyata Dukam Tasmat Necheta Tad Buddha. Shri Brahmana Uvacha Sukham Indriyakam Rajan Svarge Naraka Evacha Dehinam Yadyata Dukam Tasman Necheta Tad Buddha. Thank you very much. The word for word, Shri Brahmana Uvacha. The saintly Brahmana said, Sukham, happiness. Aindriyakam, generated from the material senses. Rajan, O king. Svarge, in material heaven. Narake, in hell. Eva, certainly. Cha, also. Dehinam, of the embodied living beings. Yat, since. Yata, just as. Dukam, unhappiness. Tasmat, therefore. Na, not. Icheta, should desire. Tat, that. Buddha, one who knows. And the translation, this is by the disciples of Srila Prabhupada, as is the purport. The saintly Brahmana said, O king, the embodied living entity automatically experiences unhappiness in heaven or hell. Similarly, Happiness will also be experienced even without one seeking it. Therefore, a person of intelligent discrimination does not make any endeavor to obtain such material happiness. And the purport: one should not uselessly waste his life pursuing material sense gratification, because a specific quantity of material happiness will automatically come to one as a result of one's past and present fruitive activities. This lesson is learned from the Ajagara, or python, who lies down and accepts for his maintenance whatever comes of its own accord. Remarkably, in both material heaven and hell, happiness and unhappiness come automatically due to our previous activities. Although the proportions of happiness and unhappiness certainly vary. Either in heaven or in hell, one may eat, drink, sleep, and have sex life, but these activities, being based on the material body, are temporary and inconsequential. An intelligent person should see that even the best material situation is actually a punishment for previous unlawful activities executed outside the scope of loving devotional service to God. A conditioned soul undergoes great trouble to obtain a little happiness. After struggling in material life, which is full of hardship and hypocrisy, one may receive a little sense gratification, but this illusory pleasure in no way offsets the burden of suffering one must bear to obtain it. After all, a pretty hat is no cure for a homely face. If one really wants to solve life's problems, one should live simply and reserve the major portion of one's life for loving service to Krishna. Even those who do not serve God receive a certain standard of maintenance from him. Therefore, we can just imagine the security the Lord affords to those who dedicate their lives to his devotional service. Unrefined, fruitive workers foolishly worry only about the present life, whereas more pious karmis imprudently make elaborate arrangements for future material sense gratification, unaware that all such enjoyment is temporary. The real solution, however, is to understand that by pleasing the personality of Godhead, who's the master of all senses and all desires, one can attain permanent happiness. Such knowledge easily solves the problems of life. Om Jnana-timirandasya Gnanjana Shlakaya Chakshurinmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Svam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Svapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shuta Padakamlam Shri Gurum Vaishnavam Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sagana Ragvatam Vitam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakha Vitam Shah Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagat Pate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namosute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radha Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Taribhyascha Kripa Sindhubhye Vacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnebhyo Namo Namaha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimata Ramapada Swami Iti Namine Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimata Bhaktivedanta Swami Iti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So I'll just read the translation once again for this text 1 of this new chapter we are beginning. The saintly Brahmana said, O king, the embodied living entity automatically experiences unhappiness in heaven or hell. Similarly, happiness will also be experienced even without one seeking it. Therefore, a person of intelligent discrimination does not make any endeavor to obtain such material happiness. Good morning. So, Srila Vishwanath, in commenting on this text, notes that this 8th chapter has 9 gurus, such as the python, which are described, as well as the story of Pingala, which we heard in the introduction. So these gurus or teachers, they teach the Brahmana to have a distaste for material pleasure. That's the fundamental teaching. So one can note, if one looks in our common American society, there's a term, the pleasure principle. And this is a principle that's, or a term that's used in psychoanalysis. And the pleasure principle is defined as the automatic adjustment of mental activity to secure pleasure or gratification and avoid pain. So pleasure is defined as securing a pleasant feeling or experiencing a sense of enjoyment or delight or satisfaction. So there's a wonderful statement that's made. It's also by the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. It's in a purport from the previous canto, the 10th canto, the 7th chapter. And this is the statement, because we're looking at this pleasure principle idea. The personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, is the reservoir of innumerable enchanting pastimes, and thus he is the source of innumerable varieties of pleasure. In fact, he's the ocean of eternal pleasure. So it's a very interesting statement, taken into account one could say, very limited outlook from the psychoanalytic point of view of how one pursues the pleasure principles. One's just making a mental adjustment. So in one sense, the mental adjustment would have to take into account this statement from the Bhagavatam that Lord Krishna is the source of innumerable varieties of pleasure. In fact, he's the ocean of eternal pleasure. So if one were to consider one such pastime, because the pleasure is supposed to rest on being connected to his pastimes. So there's a very short pastime, but we can hear it and we can test out the pleasure that comes from hearing the pastime. So this is from Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So it's after the killing of the Kaliya serpent. Since it was almost night, and all the inhabitants of Vrindavan, including the cows and calves, were very tired, they decided to take their rest on the riverbank. In the middle of the night, while they were taking rest, there was suddenly a great forest fire, and it quickly appeared that the fire would soon devour all the inhabitants of Vrindavan. As soon as they felt the warmth of the fire, they immediately took shelter of Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Although he was playing just like their child, they began to say, "Our dear Krishna, O Supreme Personality of Godhead, our dear Balaram, reservoir of all strength, please try to save us from this all-devouring and devastating fire. We have no shelter other than you. This devastating fire will swallow us all." Thus they prayed to Krishna, saying that they could not take any shelter other than his lotus feet. Lord Krishna, being compassionate upon his own townspeople, immediately swallowed up the whole forest fire and saved them. This was not impossible for Krishna, because he is unlimited. he has unlimited power to do anything he desires. So one can gauge for oneself the effect of hearing such a wonderful pastime and the great happiness it produces in the mind. Now, the same purport, going back to the 10th canto, where I read the wonderful statement of Krishna being the source of unlimited pleasure, it explains that this pleasure that is experienced is pleasure on the soul level. Since, by nature, the living being is an eternal individual being, and the Lord is eternally the maintainer of the individual living beings. So that connection has to be there. So Lord Krishna explains this eternality of the soul in this way. Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be, when he's talking to Arjuna in the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. And interestingly, Lord Krishna is the source of pleasure in that he also is the creator of the different qualities of living entities. Since the pleasure principle, from the psychoanalytic point of view, has to do with an adjustment of mental activity, one can note that intelligence and knowledge are listed as two of those qualities that are created by Lord Krishna. Because obviously, mental adjustment calls for usage of intelligence, and it also calls for having a body of knowledge that you're drawing from, whereby you can draw from as you're utilizing your intelligence. So intelligence, so this is one of the qualities that's actually bestowed by or created by Lord Krishna in living beings. So intelligence has a bearing on mental activity in that, by definition, it's the power to analyze things in their proper perspective. And knowledge is defined as understanding what is spirit and what is matter. So Srila Prabhupada notes that in modern education, there's no knowledge about spirit. The emphasis is on material elements and taking care of bodily needs. So this again has implications in terms of experiencing pleasure in connection with Lord Krishna on the earth, on the part of the individual living being. So to paint the picture of when there isn't this connection with Lord Krishna and understanding him as the source of all pleasure, and where there isn't this ability to utilize the intelligence based on even this little piece of knowledge about Krishna, a very alarming situation takes place in terms of mental activity, because we're looking at how pleasure is so much connected to adjustment of mental activity. So this is the alarming situation that happens. So again, returning to this purport in the 10th canto in the 7th chapter, there's this statement: when the eternal soul is bereft of the constitutional pleasure that comes from loving service to the Lord, he is overwhelmed and bewildered by material nature. So factually, the individual being gets covered over and made helpless by the greater force of material nature. And Lord Krishna, he gives insight. So imagine that's actually the condition in the mind of the regular person who hasn't made this connection with Lord Krishna. Actually, there's a feeling of overwhelm, a feeling of being bewildered. So Lord Krishna, he gives insight. He says, the spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actuality carried out by these modes of material nature. So a person in material consciousness, Srila Prabhupada writes, is convinced by the false ego that he's the doer of everything. So this is being completely oblivious to the fact that there's this connection with Lord Krishna and that he's maintaining one. So the person lacks the knowledge that the mechanism of the body is produced by material nature, which works under the supervision of the Lord. So completely oblivious of that fact. So this person takes all credit for doing things independently, chases after material sense gratification. So that's a contrasting picture. So in looking at the mental activity of this sort of being, there's a description again coming in that excellent purport from the 10th canto, the 7th chapter. He thinks one material object is good and another is bad. And he constantly changes his assessment of what is good and what is bad. So this is the mental activity, this moving from one pole to the other pole. So if one were to consider conflicting feelings, then this would in fact be the first stage of making an ethical inquiry. This is an opportunity. If one becomes aware of this, the way the mind is moving from this is good, this is bad, the same thing may be good, the same thing may be bad, then it's an opportunity to make an ethical inquiry so that there's a reassessment or a reconstruction, an internal mental reconstruction should happen. It immediately comes to mind some years ago, well, quite a lot of years ago, my brother and I traveled, we met in London and we were going to travel to Croatia because my intention had been to return my father's ashes to his birthplace because he was very attached to his birthplace. And as it turned out, I did a photograph of the house and the property where his birth had been. And subsequently, I sent a beautifully printed black and white image to my brother. And initially, he was delighted. And a very short while later, he was rejecting it. So I thought, this is how the mind works. You know, something is one moment, it's considered valuable. The next minute, it's considered totally useless. So anyway, that just came to mind as this thing of if one becomes aware of how there's this movement from one polar end to the opposite polar end, it's an opportunity to reassess everything and to reconstruct internally. So in making this kind of reassessment, one can discover that something that's desirable may not be so desirable, and everything that is prized may not be praiseworthy. So if this were not to happen, meaning that one doesn't start to consider these conflicting feelings or thoughts, the following ensues. This is how it goes. One derives no pleasure, no peace. One's in constant anxiety. One has been thrashed by the laws of material nature because as time passes, there's aging and all the horrors of aging, of the senses not functioning properly. One gets thrashed by material nature because diseases set in because of the imbalance in thinking and feelings. Beginning on the subtle level, it manifests on the gross level. And then finally, of course, death, and then, of course, having to go through rebirth. So one can begin to understand why the Brahmana has distaste for material pleasure. Because if you think again, this idea of what's actually happening internally, mentally, you can't say that there's actually material pleasure. So Srila Vishwanath puts it in one sentence, what the Brahmana learns from the Python in 4 verses, which is coming up. So one should not over-endeavor for maintaining the material body. So a distinction has to be made between the body of the spirit soul, which is destructible, and the possessor of the body, the spirit soul, who is indestructible and eternal. So that is something of the reassessment, the reconstruction that should take place when a person is faced understanding this terrible internal mental state that a regular person has to live with. And Krishna explains it this way. These bodies belonging to the eternal soul, which is indestructible and very small, are said to be temporary. And he goes on to say to Arjuna, therefore fight. So there's an interesting account that's given. This is a book that was given to me after doing one of the children's camps maybe a year ago. And it's a book called Plug into Happiness. Somebody called Shubha Vilas and somebody else has written it. And it points to the importance of having a purpose in life that aligns with the bigger goal. So the explanation that is given by this Shubha Vilas in this book, the Plug into Happiness, he explains that Lord Krishna engaged a young warrior, Arjuna, in a lengthy, purpose-driven dialogue. And as a result, Arjuna stood up armed with clarity about his purpose. So he was ever conscious that his purpose was to establish a kingdom founded on Dharma and guided by lofty values. So there has to be a shift. As one's beginning to understand that one has to start making ethical inquiries into why one is actually moving from one polar end to the other in one's assessment of things. There has to then actually be this concern about finding purpose. So continuing on the need for ethical inquiry to allow for a reconstruction or a reassessment. Often a dialogue with oneself may not be sufficient to obtain clarity on what is one's purpose. So talking to someone that one values and respects does wonders, so this Shubha Vilas gentleman is saying, in helping one to bring focus on one's own purpose. So the dialogue between the Brahmana and the king no doubt also assists the Brahmana to have clarity on what is his purpose. I mean, he's able to articulate it so clearly, and clearly this has to do because he's having a dialogue with somebody that has shown great respect to him, so naturally he's going to value that personality, the king, King Yadu. So the pursuit of spiritual happiness, that is actually the purpose. And having such a clear purpose allows one to know what one wants to do with one's life. So the Brahmana demonstrated what is the combination of achievement, of what he's learned, and fulfillment, the conclusions that allow for him to actually have this kind of very clear purpose. And in this particular section that we're touching on today, he understands what his conclusion is. There's a distaste for material pleasure. And this is what has put him on the road to happiness. And it's that pleasure principle from the spiritual perspective. So quite different from the material psychoanalytic analysis of the pleasure principle of just making a mental adjustment. It requires a great deal of reassessment. It requires a dialogue, preferably with somebody that one greatly respects, and finding a purpose. So there's a breakdown that's given in this book, Plug into Happiness, of finding a purpose and what questions you can ask yourself. So, and I found this very interesting because even as somebody who's been on the path of devotional life and accepting the connection with Lord Krishna and that is where happiness lies, there is come a crisis point because there's a service that was occupied 2.5 decades is not there. So, one has to look at how is the happiness now going to come, because one still wishes to serve. So I found this very interesting, this breakdown into questions one can ask oneself, or how one finds purpose for oneself. So this is the breakdown from Shubha Vilas. What am I to do with my time that is important? So one has to discover what one is passionate about. Secondly, one can contemplate things that matter the most to one as a person. So finding purpose is a process that entails spending time reflecting on what matters to one. A third thing, what do you enjoy doing that you've let go of and which would make you happy? The fourth guideline is there an activity which makes you forget hunger and thirst? So the ability could be applied behind the purpose. So the fifth guideline is find a problem you care about and start solving it. Now it's interesting, in this particular book, he gives an example of how a particular person found purpose in his life. This gentleman in Andheri had 2 sons who were on a motorbike, and they hit a pothole in the road, and both of them got thrown off the motorbike. One had a helmet and the other didn't, so the one who didn't have the helmet suffered a head injury and died. And so this gentleman started to think just in this kind of way of what was important to him. How was he going to find purpose rather than just grieving at the loss of one's son? And he decided that, one thing he could do was actually research and start looking at where there were potholes in different roads in his area. And he then took, stones and gravel and sand, and he started filling up potholes. So he was actually going to perform a service that would prevent the death of others, because he discovered that his son was not the first who had died in this kind of way. So that was thinking about an ability one has that one can utilize behind a purpose that one sets for oneself. So thinking about death also forces one to think about what is important to one and what needs focus, and what is frivolous and what can be put aside. And I can tell you that I've been thinking very carefully about all these particular guidelines for myself personally, and they're very well broken down. So the 7th guideline is to be flexible about discovering newer aspects of one's personality by reflecting beyond old identities that are no longer useful. So, one gets a picture of oneself and, the role one occupies, but one may have to move past that picture and the role one occupied, and try and discover a newer aspect of oneself. So in this way, one finds a purpose that is bigger than oneself and reflects values that determine one's priorities and guide one's actions. So these were some thoughts that came from just examining this first verse and what's to come up, and this particular Brahmana's analysis that led to him having a distaste for material pleasure. So if there's some thoughts that can expand on our discussion, please feel free.
I was thinking about the statement that you made on the psychologists, scientists coming to understand the pivotal presence of the mind in terms of the pursuance of happiness and sense pleasure. And specifically that you have to do an adjustment. You do an adjustment, and through that, then you may experience particular pleasure and happiness. And you also see that, in fact, in the process of yoga, the mind is very pivotal. In the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, it's all about basically that the important part that the mind plays in the process of actually elevating oneself to Krishna consciousness or elevating oneself in yoga. So one may say that actually the scientists, just through observation or through analysis, they actually can understand. They came to that important aspect that the mind plays. And I was thinking that like these 7 guidelines that you just quoted at the end, according to the level that you have in terms of your consciousness, then the mind plays this pivotal part, you know. So even in a much elevated state of consciousness, the mind is also playing a pivotal part. I mean, Krishna says the mind can be your enemy or can be your friend. So also thinking of these levels, we have this concept that is given in the scripture that is called the pancha kosha, no? The anamaya, pranamaya. What is the next one? The manamaya, vijnanamaya, and anandamaya. So different levels that are there. In the pranamaya, is just plainly physical. It's just about food. It's defined like that. It's very on the gross physical platform. And then the mind does the adjustment, and even you can go to those 7 guidelines, what's my purpose? People more or less make those adjustments. So in reality, one, according to the different levels, is using the mind for its purpose to understand or make the choice, make the adjustments that are there to achieve happiness. And then you have intelligence that is given there, the use of intelligence, which is to choose or to be able to discriminate what's good and what's wrong. So I'm rambling a little bit because I'm thinking, because this is I think these are important lessons to try to understand deeply. The question is that when you go into the 7 guidelines, understanding that your mind is working and you're trying to have a mind that is governed by higher intelligence, by buddhi. That buddhi comes from the Supreme Lord within the heart, and also from the instructions of Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. And if it's not there, sometimes we may find ourselves just also caught more or less in the trying to figure it out and it may be, we still may be caught on those levels of, the panchakosha levels, like that. So we need that type of constant instructions and shelter that is there to provide the buddhi that will allow us to make the proper mental adjustments. Without it, it may be a very, very difficult task to deal with the mind. So, you want to comment about that?
Yeah. I mean, the picture was painted of the condition of the mind where there isn't as you've pointed out, the intelligence that's actually coming from Krishna from within the heart or externally from the spiritual master. The condition of the mind is quite abysmal. I mean, in a state of anxiety, being bewildered, one has to try and determine what's important to one. One has to try and think of a new identity, so to speak. So it's actually quite challenging. And I mean, there's one hears of people going to consultants or psychologists because help is needed. Some objectivity. So indeed, the comment is that it's a very difficult situation to reform one's life unless one is in contact with persons who have had the clarity that comes from Krishna kindly giving intelligence and having one understand actual reality that isn't in this polarized kind of a reality that is the norm for most people. And you don't realize how much that polarized reality is a reality for people until you start dealing with persons who are functioning that way, like me and my brother. I see it. It's completely, the mind is operating, moving from on the same issue, from one positive end to a negative end constantly. So, indeed, it does require at least some contact with persons who have received that kindness of Krishna and the kindness of the spiritual master that can lift one out of that state of anxiety and bewilderment and moving in a polarized reality. Jitendra?
A lot of things in my mind that I've heard over the years. We had that phrase, madly engaged in chewing the chewed, blind to self-realization, lost to themselves in a network of illusions, in the conditioned soul's always thinking, feeling, and willing what you value. And then a Sudra regrets for what he did, but a Brahmin has knowledge, so he foresees the catastrophe ahead of him. And sense gratification is flickering, and it has a beginning and an end. So those are things that resonated in my mind when you were describing this chapter.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yes, those are, each and every one of those phrases refers to that mental reality that is the norm. And I mean, when one thinks about it, it's quite terrifying. Yeah, there's, I know psychologist lady who started practicing Ayurveda, so she actually passed a comment that it can be years of therapy, and persons who've been traumatized just through this, everything that's in the mind, and the way the mind operates, that it doesn't actually work. What finally gives them some peace is when she does an Ayurvedic treatment that touches all the mama points with particular transdermal Ayurvedic creams that go deep into the tissues. Then finally the persons feel some sort of deep relaxation, which so years of therapy, talking, leaves the persons in the same state of mind. So, I mean, the exposure to Lord Krishna's pastimes is quite extraordinary. There was a lady, we did a program, Kirtan Experience, on Saturday. So one lady came with her 2 children to a book table that one of the devotees from Naperville was managing. And the lady had a little boy who refused to be hearing kirtan. I mean, he was literally like trying to take his ears and squash them up so that he wouldn't have to hear. And anyway, after the kirtan experience, she came to the book table, and she was telling her child, the same boy, that she was buying him the Krishna book so he could hear all these pastimes, these wonderful pastimes of Krishna. So there was the remedial measure for actually, bringing some relief to a mind that, is just completely locked in itself, can't even open up slightly. So, yeah, this exposure to the pastimes of Krishna. And I'm understanding why Srila Prabhupada, compiled those pastimes in a storybook kind of way, because it can be the key for unlocking that terrible prison house of the mind. So thank you very much for your kind attention. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.